Right. The next session, Climate Cataclysm, the adaptation agenda is gasping. May I invite the speakers to the stage? Eduardo Martinez Diaz, Deputy Prime Minister, Cuba. Abdullah Khalil, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Maldives. Arzu Rana Diuba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Nepal. D.N. Dhungel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and External Trade from Bhutan. Wangari Mushiri, Director of Africa Global Wind Energy Council from Kenya. And the moderator, Kira Winke, Head Center for Climate and Foreign Policy, German Council on Foreign Relations. Ma'am, please join us on stage. And if I could invite the rest of the speakers as well, we're ready to start. On stage, Eduardo Martinez Diaz, Deputy Prime Minister of Cuba, Abdullah Khalil, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Nepal, from Maldives, Arzu Rana Dioba, Minister of Foreign Affairs from Nepal, D.N. Dhungel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and External Trade, Bhutan, Wangari Mushiri, Director of Africa Global Wind Energy Council, Kenya, Moderator Kira Winke, Head Center for Climate and Foreign Policy, German Council on Foreign Relations.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very timely session. We will talk about climate adaptation from the view of the most vulnerable, the V20 countries. These countries have in common that they have high exposure to the threats of climate change, but have contributed very little to its cause, global carbon emissions. In this current situation, we are facing that many countries have difficulties in financing adaptation measures, in particular, because often there is no business case for adaptation. We have also witnessed the withdrawal of the United States from USAID efforts, from climate finance, and there's a huge gap that needs to be filled. In 2022, we had 28 billion in global adaptation finance. However, the need is between 190, maybe 300 billion annually, according to a UNEP analysis. So the gap to finance global adaptation efforts is huge. Even industrialized countries are struggling with extreme weather events. And this means that the most vulnerable countries, who often also do not have sufficient capacities to address the extra stressors of climate change, face significant constraints to deal with this crisis. This morning, we have already heard statements on climate change undermining our security and the interaction of traditional and non-traditional security threats. It is my pleasure to have this excellent panel together, this very high-level panel to discuss this very topic of today. My first question goes to you, Minister Diaz, on the current adaptation efforts and how they're not keeping pace with the increase of extreme events and their rising frequency. How can this dramatic acceleration of adaptation happen? And how can we minimize future economic loss in countries like an island state like your own? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Distinguidos colegas, agradezco en primer lugar al gobierno de la India por invitarnos a participar en esta importante reunión.
Distinguished guests, I thank the government of India for the invitation to participate in this important meeting.
El cambio climático no es un riesgo a futuro, sino un peligro presente y real para millones de personas en el mundo.
Climate change is not a future risk, but a present and real danger for millions of people around the world.
La posición de Cuba ante los retos climáticos y del desarrollo de nuestras naciones siempre ha sido la salvaguarda de los reclamos históricos de los países en desarrollo en particular los más vulnerables a los efectos del cambio climático, con especial énfasis en los pequeños estados insulares.
Cuba's position on the climate and development challenges facing our nations has always been to defend the historic rights of developing countries, especially those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, with a special emphasis on small island states.
La consolidación de la alianza de los pequeños estados insulares en desarrollo, como la voz que representa a los países que enfrentamos los impactos más graves de un fenómeno global que no causamos, ha contribuido a visibilizar nuestras circunstancias especiales y a reivindicar los derechos de nuestros pueblos a existir y progresar.
The consolidation of the alliance of small island developing states has the voice of the countries most affected by a global phenomenon, not of our making, has helped to give visibility to our special circumstances and to defend the right of our peoples to exist and to develop.
Los países desarrollados deben asumir la responsabilidad histórica que les corresponde en apoyo a los esfuerzos internacionales para alcanzar el desarrollo sostenible de los países más necesitados.
Developed countries must assume their historic responsibility to support international efforts to achieve sustainable development in developing countries.
En este contexto, la reprobable decisión del gobierno de los Estados Unidos de retirarse del Acuerdo de París y de cesar sus compromisos financieros con la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático constituye un duro golpe a la cooperación internacional.
In this context, the reprehensible decision of the United States government to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and to cease its financial commitments to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is a serious blow to international cooperation.
Para Cuba, el principal obstáculo para el bienestar y el desarrollo de su pueblo y la protección ante los efectos del cambio climático es el criminal bloqueo económico, comercial y financiero que por más de 60 años mantiene los Estados Unidos contra mi país, reforzado con la arbitraria inclusión de Cuba en la lista unilateral de estados que supuestamente patrocinan el terrorismo.
For Cuba, the main obstacle to the well-being and development of its people and the protection before the effects of climate change is the criminal, economic, commercial, and financial blockade that the United States has maintained against my country for more than 60 years, reinforced by the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba in the unilateral list of states that allegedly sponsor terrorism.
Estimados colegas, el resultado de la COP29 en relación con la nueva meta financiera global marca la pauta de la agenda climática internacional. Sin embargo, el limitado compromiso en el apoyo financiero impactará la capacidad de los países en desarrollo para emprender acciones de adaptación más ambiciosas y efectivas.
The COP29 outcome on the new global finance goal sets the tone for the global climate agenda. However, the very limited commitment to the financial support will impact the capacity of developing countries to make more effective and ambitious adaptation actions.
En este contexto, esperamos que el compromiso de los países desarrollados de duplicar para el 2025 las finanzas para la adaptación y el incremento de sus contribuciones al Fondo de Pérdidas y Daños tenga un lugar central en el debate climático internacional.
In this context, we hope that the commitment by developed countries to double adaptation finance by 2025 and to increase their contribution to loss and damage fund will be central to the international climate debate.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important introduction to the topic. Minister Khalil, you are from the Maldives. Your nation is an island nation of low-lying atolls. How would you respond to this question of accelerating adaptation efforts and minimizing future losses?
Thank you very much, first of all, and also let me begin by thanking Observer Research Foundation and the government of India for this timely discussion. Maldives, as you have rightly mentioned, it's a very low-lying nation. Specifically, some of the islands, it is less than 1 meter above the sea level. So we like any other island nations, Maldives is facing severe challenges of climate change. Um, uh, some of the islands, most of the islands, in fact, it is the highest point in the Maldives, it is 1 meter above the sea level. So it's a huge challenge in the Maldives. Um, Also, uh, I would like to reiterate that given that the nature of the islands or Maldives as a whole, or specifically the other smaller islands as well, these island states or SIDS, it usually produces, for instance, less than 2.5% of the harmful gases to the atmosphere, which means the contribution to the global warming or sea level rise as a result is very much insignificant. So that is where I believe larger nations needs to come forward, as my colleague here has just now mentioned, with appropriate funding. Rightly, you have mentioned at the beginning, it's at the moment it is 28 billion. It is raised for climate funding, but the need is not basically 300 billion. It's in trillions of dollars. So that's where the funding is required for smaller island nations to mitigate the climate changes that the smaller island nations and similar nations are facing. Number one, it is definitely raising the appropriate funding. At the same time, I believe we have noticed that many institutions have mentioned that the availability of the funds. But then when we go for uh, when we send for instance proposals to raise funding, it's quite difficult to access the funding, and also sometimes the cost of funding is also quite not uh, very appropriate for island nations like Maldives, specifically when such nations are um, having debt burdens at the same time. So it's a question of, for instance, whether we service the debt or whether we service or whether we finance the environment mitigation programs. So that's where these environment related funding is really important for these island nations to accelerate. It is the finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for highlighting these diverse economic impacts that are being faced. And of course, we are focusing today on financing adaptation, but of course, we should also mention that there are non-economic losses, cultural heritage that is being threatened by climate change. And this is something one should also not forget, that there are things that are being lost from climate change that cannot be compensated with money. I would now like to turn to Minister Duba. You have heard the statements from the island nations. You are coming from a completely different context from the context of Nepal, where the climate impacts are nevertheless also being felt increasingly and devastatingly with glacial melt, flooding, etc. Can you also comment from your perspective, from the perspective of High Asia, on this question of how to accelerate adaptation, momentum, finance, and how to minimize the future losses?
Thank you so much, Kira. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially the Ministry of External Affairs of India and the ORF for inviting me here, and especially for organizing such a wonderful session, a session that is much required in this day and age. First of all, from the point of view of the V20 countries, and especially from the point of view of Nepal, I would like to say that just even for climate justice, the financial aspects of supporting adaptation has to be increased. And the increment is not only in billions, but like you said, like my colleague who spoke before me said, it has to be in trillions of dollars. And countries like Nepal, we already have our national adaptation plans. We have devoted 45% of our small country to the landscape is all under forest. It's heavily forested. We have preserved our land, but that doesn't ensure that we don't have climate induced disasters. Just at the last of last monsoon, which is in September, we had 3 days of incessant rain. We lost livelihood, lives, infrastructure, crops, which totaled almost 45 billion Nepalese rupees, which is, I can't say, I'm very bad at converting money, but it's a lot of money for a country like Nepal. We are very committed to our NAPA plans, the national adaptation plans, but we need something like $45.9 billion in external assistance. And as you know, the environment right now is not right for raising that kind of money from the traditional donors. So what do we do? So this is why I think this conversation is at a very good point, because we need to reach out and look at more options for funding projects like this, for programs like this, and maybe reaching out to the private sector. Debt like nature swaps for conservation, and nature and debt swaps, green bonds, blended finance could be some of the ways out. But I have to tell you frankly, Nepal as a traditional country has not really thought through the processes of how we are going to initiate this. So conversations like this will surely help us in raising that kind of money. But even the conscious uh, the consciousness and the conscience of the countries who have been responsible for increasing the global temperatures should think very seriously, because that doesn't really only affect island states or the glaciers melting in countries like mine. It affects the whole world. Where will we go if planet Earth dies? Where will we go if the temperature really rises to more than 2 degrees? These are very, very serious questions that we should look at. And it's not only funds that we need, we also need data. We need to know when the clouds are going to burst. We need to know when the storms are coming. We need to know when there is going to be no water. And we also need technologies. We've in the morning session and in the sessions yesterday, we heard a lot about AI. So is it only going to benefit the aggrandization of rich economies? Or is AI also going to look at how issues such as drought, such as managing pollution, going to be, will it adapted, will AI be adapted or trained towards these issues? Is it going to look at how diseases are migrating? So we have lots of issues that we need to look head on and tackle. Also, infrastructure that we have lost. For Nepal, it's very, very expensive to build infrastructure, and we don't have that much resources. But the minute we build it, we haven't really even used it, and it's gone. So, how can we climate proof infrastructure? Who's going to look at climate insurance risks? So, these are many questions that need to be answered. And I'm glad I'm in this platform, because these are questions I don't have answers to, but I think collectively, these are things that we can all talk to and come up with. And I think in the next questions, we are also going to look at some Marshall Plan issues. So I hope my other participants will also be talking to that. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I will. I will pick up on that. Given what the other speakers have just described, the intensity of the impacts, the acceleration of both sudden onset events such as tropical cyclones, but also slow onset events, sea level rise, glacial melt. Does the global south need a Marshall Plan type of effort towards adaptation? And if so, who would lead this effort, or who should lead this effort? Minister Dungyal, from your perspective, from Bhutan, please.
Thank you, Kira. I must thank the organizers at the outset for organizing this very important event, the Raisina dialogue. This is my second time attending this dialogue. The first was last year. This year I came over, and I'd like to thank the organizers as well as the Ministry of External Affairs here in India for giving us this opportunity. We have just heard right from the sea level of Maldives to the Himalayas in Nepal. Bhutan is not an exception. Bhutan, although it's in the Himalayas, although we have lot of conservation efforts which are enshrined in our constitution, yet the climate effects are not sparing Bhutan even. Therefore, the question that is brought in front of me is, do we need a climate marshal? If so, who should lead it? On this, I must quote, or I must say that whatever we plan or we come up with should be based on climate justice. The climate justice that is very clearly emphasized by none other than Honorable Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Modi ji. There should be obvious recognition for countries which are carbon neutral or carbon negative. Bhutan is a net carbon negative country, yet the effect of climate change affects Bhutan in a big way. Therefore, what we need is, apart from my colleagues just spoke about the funding part, funding part on the climate mitigation. Along with that, what we need is the political will to implement it as it comes. Unless we have that will to implement the mitigation efforts, we will not be able to bring changes in the climate effects. If we talk of Bhutan as a country, the climate adaptation program, if Bhutan only has to implement it, we need over 14 billion US dollars. For a country like Bhutan, which has just graduated from its LDC category, this is a big amount. Therefore, we need to collaborate, we need to have funds, and we need to have political will for the implementation of it. Now, on the climate marshal, leadership is another one that I'd like to talk about here. Unless we have a coalition of countries, similar countries, we will not be able to again mitigate the climate change. What Bhutan has spearheaded very recently is that was just in the last COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. We initiated a coalition of carbon neutral and carbon negative countries, a coalition among Bhutan, Madagascar, Panama, and Suriname. That is called Z0. Now, this is a coalition of carbon neutral and carbon negative countries. Have this sort of mini lateralism among the multilateralism, we will be able to have a say in the world, and our voice will be heard by them. If Bhutan only raises the issue of climate change and climate mitigation, our voice gets lost in between. It loses its importance. So, to be able to heard outside, what we need to do is maybe make this sort of mini lateral a coalition of small countries, like-minded states, which are affected equally by climate change. Although we are carbon negative or carbon neutral, the effect of the world gets shared with us also, and we get affected in a big way. Therefore, these small countries, a coalition or independent countries, independent states should be allowed to have a voice or allowed to have a voice or should be allowed to have a say in the decision making so that small countries also contribute to the mitigation of climate change. Hence, in the spirit of equality and justice, small countries along with bigger economies, bigger states could collaborate. And in fact, today through this area, through this uh, opportunity, I would like to share that like Bhutan has done on the Z0 coalition of small nations, all carbon negative and carbon neutral nations, I'd like to urge upon other states and other nations also to join us and to appreciate us and to support us in mitigating climate change. Climate marshal is required. Unless we have that, we'll not be able to take it forward. But who should lead? It is a coalition. It's not one nation or it's not one country that will lead this. It has to be a coalition, either in the multilateral arena or as we have done through Bhutan's initiative, the mini-lateral avenue that we have created. Therefore, group of coalition countries, like-minded states should take this forward and ensure that mitigation work is done by smaller nations as well as by the bigger states. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for highlighting the connection between the need for mitigation to keep adaptation options open. I would like to turn to you, Hangari, and ask you, many developing countries are heavily burdened by debt. And we are seeing this rising additional pressure on adaptation finance in these countries and all over the world. Why has there not been the ability to unify debt restructuring, for example, by China and the Paris Club, who set out to find ways for enabling restructuring of debt? Can you comment on this?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Kira, for having me, and really to ORF and the government of India. We really appreciate the invitation to be here today. Now, to come to the question around debt relief and debt restructuring, especially for the V20 countries, which now are 60 in total, there's been quite a lot of conversation around how they're the victims, right? And it's rightfully so. They did not contribute to the climate crisis. The bigger economies did. And a lot of the times, the most vulnerable countries are the ones that are suffering the highest impacts of climate change. Now, normally that narrative that we're told, or when we're speaking on global platforms, this is the narrative that kind of tends to be pushed forward. I think it's important when we're looking at debt restructuring and looking at debt for climate swaps or debt for energy swaps to take back the power and to take back the power from who is actually having the conversation. So if we're looking at restructuring debt and looking at finding new ways of convincing the global north to either forgive debt or to restructure it a different way, then it's a conversation that we need to have more frankly. And this means we also need to speak their language. And for so long, we've been speaking as a vulnerable V20 countries. I come from one of them called Kenya. So many of them are in Africa. So many of them are across Latin America and Asia. These countries are really struggling. And so what happens is we need to now look and say, it's not a conversation of me being the victim, but it's a conversation of economic value. If you think about what happens when there's flooding or when there's heat waves, supply chains of many products get disrupted. So it's really a question of economic stability. And one thing that a country like Pakistan did very well in 2022 when they had the floods is they really linked the floods to how much economic disruption is happening, which made sure that the West and the global North countries were listening. I think the second thing that we need to do when we're really restructuring this conversation is looking at it as a geopolitical issue. Now, what happens when there's climate refugees globally? They tend to migrate to the global north. And so that means that there'll be more people coming into different countries. When you speak about that, and rather than staying in their own home states, but when you speak about that, the global north also tends to listen. So I think it's important to also have that conversation about it being a geopolitical issue. And then finally, when you look at what climate change or adaptation investment is, for every $1 spent on adaptation, that's $4 to $7 that you spent on or that you save on disaster recovery. So it's an investment, right? And so we need to start looking at these conversations differently rather than the narrative that has been pushed forward, which is, we're the victims of this. Now, coming to your question around restructuring debt and really looking at it from a perspective of how do we um, convince a lot of the global north countries, China, and others to either restructure the debt or to forgive the debt or to do the debt for nature swaps, as was mentioned by Honorable Minister before. And one of the things that we need to look at, speaking quite frankly, is that debt is political, or debt restructuring is political. I'll tell you a bit of a story. If I take a loan from a bank and I'm not able to repay it, but I go back to the bank and I say, okay, but I'll plant trees and I will make sure that I take care of people who don't have food and I'll make sure that I make sure that the streets are clean. Maybe the bank has to pay through this through its CSR funding. How do we have the conversation and change the whole conversation around what are we doing for the benefit of all of us through these debt climate swaps? And so when you look at why there's not been a typical, alignment between the Paris Club and China, it's because the structures in which these two groups of people, these two areas think about debt. When you negotiate with the Paris Club, it's several countries coming together and talking as one. When you negotiate with China, China's debt restructuring or debt negotiations tend to be bilateral. So there's already misalignment in the structure in how these things are set up. In addition to that, when you look at how much debt is actually owed, many African countries, I'll talk about Africa here, 80% of the debt that African countries hold is with the private sector. How are we bringing private sector into the room to have these conversations around how we restructure debt to climate swaps? And so it's important to really look at what's the core reason or the root cause of why this is not working well. Now, I would say, and I think the minister from Bhutan has put it very, very well, we do need a global South leadership around this. And we need people, and my president, President Ruto, has been very vocal about a new way of being or a new way of financing these mechanisms. And so if we can find, as you called it, minilateralism, which I think is fantastic, ways or groups to negotiate together and say, as Africans or as global South countries, we'll come together, we'll get a much better deal for this. Now, what is happening is every single country is trying to restructure its own debt separately, talking to each party separately. And so this means that you can only go in with the information that you have. But when you come together with 60 other countries or 20 other countries, so in the V20, there's actually 60 countries, when you come together with a bigger group of people, then you're able to get a much better deal from this. So I think those are the few points I'd like to put forward into how to restructure that and why it's not working at the moment.
Thank you so much. And I give a first warning to the audience that in a second it will be your turn to ask questions. So please prepare your questions and maybe get in line for the microphones. But before I turn to the audience, Minister Duba, I would like to ask you on this debt for nature swaps. Is this something that could provide an answer to financing adaptation and development in your viewpoint? Yes.
Okay. Like I said, this is for me a new concept, but I know it has been there for a long time. I think since 1987, WWF tried it out, and it has had mixed results. In many countries, it has worked well. In some others, it has not worked that well. And I think the basic of it is what Wangari just talked about. Okay, if we are going to, clear off our debt and do this, how is it going to benefit? Will you wipe our debt out? So when we talk about things like that, I think there are few things that we have to keep in mind, because I read in the literature that if it's like a 600 million equivalent debt, that's brought down to 100 million. So who is it really going to benefit? I think that is one question. The other is it really being used for what it is stipulated to be used for? So the technicalities of it, the modalities, the proceedings of how these debts are going to be worked out, I think has needs some careful consideration. Same with green bonds and with blended finance. But as the world is moving along in a new path where maybe the traditional donor kind of grant may not be available in the near future, hopefully in the midterm and the long term future, the world is going to look more different. uh, we have to start looking at these new ways of financing climate adaptation and mitigation measures. For this, I think the Marshall Plan is also something that will help us, because it will hopefully create a group. We should look at this very minutely and look at the kind of things required to actually do this kind of work with the private sector, because the private sector also lives in the same world. It doesn't matter how rich you are. If your global commons, if you don't have good air to breathe, if you don't have good water to drink, it doesn't matter how rich you are. So I think the private sector also has a very strong role to play, but we need to point it out to them. But we also must have a methodology or different kind of modalities to ensure that it really does work, that there is some accounting for it, and really the voice of people sitting at the table talking about this is going to be very, very important. And I hope all of us will be sitting at the table talking about these issues.
Thank you. I'm now looking at potential questions. I'm looking at the Raisina Young Fellows. Yes, please.
My name is Wahid from Amali Asset Management. And my 2 cents on this is there's sufficient private capital today, and there is incredible amount of debt financing available. The banker friends are incredibly busy, constantly innovating, bringing new products into the market, whether it's Natixis, whether it's HSBC, whether it's Standard Charter. Some of them are bringing unique tools to even increase the liquidity of certain instruments to make these projects come to life. On the private equity side,
Question, please.
they have a lot of dry powder. And with this context, what are the channels of communication that are open to further engage with the key stakeholders here? Our Kenyan friends, they introduced regulatory reforms that made it easy for private capital to go into carbon credit projects and unlock significant funding. Our Tanzanian friends alike.
Okay,
so what are the channels of communication? And the second question, how can we enable the political will for these projects to come to life at a national, regional, and most importantly, at a local municipal level to engage with land stewards? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Wangari, we would like to jump in on this one.
Great. Thank you so much for your question, and absolutely fantastic. Thank you also for highlighting that Kenya is made it easier for private sector investment within this climate space. It's true. At this point, we are not getting enough money into climate, and so we need to pull on all the straws we can pull on at the moment, whether that's carbon credits, whether it's the debt for nature swaps, as we said. And also, it's true that if we can find private sector investment, so if you look at the amount of money it takes to build a wind farm, for Kenya, the largest wind farm on the continent cost $780 million. If, like the minister from Nepal said, if it's 600 million is the debt, can we build a wind farm instead of having to pay debt back? And so these are some of the really serious questions we need to be asking. Now, to come to your question around what channels of communications are there, I speak from an industrial trade association. So we have 2,500 members, private sector members. We engage with governments regularly. Go to your local associations. They're already engaging with government on behalf of the industry. So if you're able to get some of these, in Kenya, we have the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. In all the different countries, there are private sector bodies. Then if you're able to engage with them, they can also help put muscle, private sector voice behind your query to different governments.
Thank you. Next question, please. And please introduce yourself and also keep your remarks short. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. My question is about insurance. While we are figuring out climate financing, the vulnerable communities are already been affected, and millions of them in droves in the global south. So I want to know what non-traditional insurance product the V20 is looking at that can address the immediate challenges that is happening right now before debt financing get figured out, before regulations get figured out, before policies get figured out?
Thank you. Who would like to come in on the point of insurance?
I would like to come in, but not because I have an answer, because I have a question about who could help us to create such products, and maybe somebody in the room who's more savvy about things like insurance could also answer or give us a lead, because I'm also looking for people who would do insurance on things like this. And maybe, that's why I'm happy for this forum, because I'm learning a lot of new things and also trying to find out where are the resources that could help us to take this conversation to its destination. So I also want to just add to his question.
Thank you for throwing it back to the room, because this is exactly what also the Raisina dialogue is about, to find connections, to find allies, to move these important topics forward. I'm looking for the next question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Yes, my question is about COP30. So looking ahead to that, what are the key priorities on the global climate finance action agenda that vulnerable nations would like to see, especially regarding the Baku WM roadmap to deliver the 1.3 trillion for climate action in developing countries by 2035? That was agreed at COP29 last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Expectations for the COP30. Minister Khalil, would you like to come in?
Thank you. I think it's a very important question in the first place. Like for vulnerable nations like the Maldives, for instance, uh, at the moment, Maldives is considered as second most vulnerable nation on earth by the United Nations, specifically because of environmental issues that the Maldives is facing. Now, uh, and Maldives considers, for instance, environment as one of the key priority areas for the country. As for that, I just would like to highlight in the Maldives, we have 93 protected areas. That is something like 64,000 hectares uh, and three UNESCO biosphere reserves in the Maldives we do have. So we would like to see in COP30 specifically, when it comes to small island nations, seats to come to rise as a single voice. So that is very important for smaller nations to come with a single voice and uh, convey our message as that we need to fulfill the gap, financing gap that we are having at the moment. Countries like Maldives, we are at the moment protecting the islands with sea walls, for instance, and we have to do other mitigation measures to protect our people as well. That is the lifeline of the people. I mean, we are working to protect. So coming up as a single voice by smaller nations, vulnerable nations, I think that is the way forward to raise funds and also to access the funds as well. So that is what I would like to see in COP30. Thank you.
All right, short.
I'll just add very quickly. My apologies, I'm not going to be diplomatic at all because we do not have time. For some countries, just as we've heard also from the minister from the Maldives, it's really an existential crisis. So we gave developed countries, a couple of years to raise $100 billion. They were not able to do it. We went to Baku, we committed 1.3 trillion. They were not able to deliver on that. So at COP30, it's a do or die moment. And so we don't have time to discuss. It needs to be on the table, and the finance needs to be clearly laid out for developing countries.
Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister Diaz, COP30 will be in a Latin American country in your region. What is your expectation for climate adaptation?
Sí, ustedes conocen que Cuba es un país, una isla pequeña en el centro del Caribe y nosotros cada vez sufrimos más los efectos del cambio climático. Y esta situación nos ha obligado a crear condiciones y hemos establecido un sistema de defensa civil que nos ha permitido salvar vidas anualmente y nos ha permitido salvar muchos recursos económicos a partir de todo un plan de país que con el que contamos.
So Cuba is in the heart of the Caribbean, as you all know, and we have suffered the impact of climate change for many years. And this we created a civil defense that which has allowed us to save many lives and to save also many resources.
Lo quisiéramos en este marco el reafirmar el compromiso que tenemos con nuestros hermanos países pequeños países insulares, en contribuir a todos los elementos que tienen que ver con la adaptación al cambio climático a través de la adaptación basada en ecosistemas y particularmente en la restauración y conservación de ecosistemas de manglares en los pequeños estados insulares en desarrollo.
Cuba reaffirms its commitment to the South cooperation and proposes to share experience to strengthen national capacities to adapt to climate change through ecosystem-based adaptation, particularly for the restoration and conservation of mangrove ecosystems in small island developing states.
Y extendemos a nuestros hermanos de los pequeños estados insulares del Pacífico el ofrecimiento para compartir nuestras experiencias con los países del Caribe en la evaluación del impacto del cambio climático en las costas arenosas y las alternativas para su control y resiliencia.
We extend to our brothers in the small island states of the Pacific the offer to share our experience with the Caribbean in assessing the impact of climate change on sandy coastlines and the alternatives for mitigation and resilience.
Thank you so much for these insights. I have one last question here, and then
this side.
can I go? No, we don't have time.
Good evening to all the panelists.
So can I ask the question?
But there is a ministerial meeting immediately right now for one of the ministers on stage. Unfortunately, we have to close. Thank you so much to everyone on stage, and my sincerest apologies to all of you and those in the audience who had very many more questions. If I could invite the panel to the top of the stage for a quick photograph. Thank you so much, everyone. My sincerest
Thank you.
apologies, Tira. If I could also request my colleagues from the production team to set the stage for the next session. Thank you. We will swiftly move to the next session once the stage is ready.